Over the last little while, I've been extremely sad for the situation in Ukraine. Obviously, everybody who is out there probably is aware of what is going on in that regard. For those who are for some context, I guess, the one company I have has 3 offices in Ukraine, so I've spent quite a bit of the last couple days working on trying to help get people out of the country and things like this, which is not good at all. So anyway, hopefully things will be very good for them, but obviously it's more like how bad it will be. Anyway, I wanted to take a little bit of time and talk about the subject of what is going on there, my perspective on kind of the geopolitics of it, how it affects the region, and from the perspective of this channel, places that people are going to go and stay, etc., over the coming while, and then maybe discuss a little bit about how this stacks up over kind of the broader overarching picture. And if you have any questions or comments, whatever, I'd love to hear from you. Put them in the comments below. If you know some people who are in Ukraine who are having troubles, etc., please also feel free to reach out to us and we can share some resources with you, etc. So I will dive in right now. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, and if you'd like help with any of these things, please reach out to us. Links are in the description below. Okay, so I won't bother going through the history of the region, etc. Lots of people have already done that, I'm sure. But maybe I'll start by giving certain context. So from my perspective, war is just plain bad. I think that in almost all situations, war just doesn't have winners. It's a terrible, terrible situation. And so in my perspective, generally speaking, we should be aiming to eliminate war or reduce war, etc. In this respect, to some extent, think that the West very poorly handled what is going on here in 2 particular ways. First of all, if you look at kind of one of the stated reasons for what went on is that Putin has for the last 20 years or so drawn a hard line in the sand, stating that if Ukraine were to be admitted into NATO, that would be tantamount to a security threat against Russia. If you were to put it into context to understand from their perspective, imagine if the Warsaw Pact still existed and Canada was going to join the Warsaw Pact. Would the US sit by and do nothing about it, right? So in that sense, I think that it was very stupid of Western leaders, and it remains stupid, and I'll comment on this in a second, not to try and negotiate and prevent something. Now, it's possible that Putin would have invaded anyway. The reality, if you look kind of at this series of events, in my opinion, is he's probably been planning this for about 10 years. And so he's chosen his moment quite strategically, and so maybe he would have. However, it would have at least been worth it to try to dissuade it, because the outcome is really horrible. And basically, I would say, all right, give them a guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO. Instead, what did the West do? They said straight up, hey, our doors are open. And in fact, as recently as I believe in the last 24 hours, Biden has said again, NATO's doors are open. Now, why does this make very little sense? It makes very little sense because of the fact that under the NATO treaties, they'd be required to protect Ukraine, but it is geopolitically impossible to protect Ukraine from a military standpoint. And so in that sense, it's not viable to admit them, etc. And so you're simply antagonizing the second most powerful military on earth. And that just doesn't strike me as being very good. It strikes me as, unfortunately, the people of Ukraine probably are going to pay a very steep price for being the pawn in some geopolitical games. The second thing I think was very stupid was how they've essentially been isolating China. Now, there's lots of reasons to make this argument about how China is positioned in the world and the relationship between the US and China. Obviously, Trump had lots of things to say about that, etc. But without Chinese support, I don't think that Russia could do this. And in my opinion, probably what happened is Putin asked Xi and got Xi's the head of China, for those who don't know, his approval when he visited Beijing for the opening of the Beijing Olympics. Again, for some more context, you have a situation where the West boycotted the Beijing Olympics, and so what happens? You have your 2 biggest enemies effectively driven into each other's arms. So that just doesn't strike me as very good. So let's kind of walk through the situation as it is and probably what's going to go on. I try to think of it from this perspective of power asymmetries And clearly the asymmetry between just Ukraine and Russia is Ukraine is severely undermatched. Now, what Ukraine does have, which is, I guess, a double-edged sword in certain ways, is motivation in spending time talking to people there over the last little while. I mean, there's a lot of people who just want to fight. I kind of had this perspective, which was reflective a little bit of what people on our teams were telling us, people contacts there, clients, etc. in Ukraine were telling me that they figured Russia would not do anything in the west of the country. And then I talked one morning to one of the people who I work fairly closely with, basically just after the invasion started. And his comment was, I said, how are you? What's going on? And he's like, horrible. I woke up to the sounds of rockets in Kiev, and so it's, very, very horrible situation. And so you think about it like, okay, these people, some of them are trying to get out. Unfortunately, again, just for some context for people who want to know, I think it was, as of the time that I'm making this video, I guess about 24 hours ago, approximately, that they closed the borders for men between ages of 18 and 60 to leave the country. And so, kind of a tip, there's something called a white ticket that can be used to help get around that if somebody wants to actually leave. And again, if you have questions, reach out to us and I'll see if I can put you in touch with some people. Anyway, not so good in that regard. If I look at this, I think, Russia clearly has the superior military force. And so, what is the outcome of that? Well, the outcome of that is that, probably Ukraine will be overrun. There's some people who suggest that Russia will just take the eastern states. I think that the problem with that, from a geopolitical standpoint, is if he leaves the current government in power and just takes those states, it's kind of like forcing the rest of the country into the arms of NATO. And he realistically doesn't want to, and kind of at this point can't do that. So this informs the idea that he'll go for the whole country. I think it is pretty likely that he will not want to spend a period actually occupying Ukraine, at least not the whole of Ukraine. And the reason for this is he would arguably have learned from Afghanistan. And Afghanistan basically trying to occupy there led to a proxy war with the US and essentially just bled Russia out. It was, by some respects, arguably the catalyst that finalized the fall of the Soviet Union. And so he has to know that and is not likely to do so. So he may try to install some sort of a puppet government. Probably he already knows who it is, who he would want to put in power there, and then probably back off to the eastern regions, and then probably provide some sort of police military support to that government so that he can dictate them. I spoke to some politicians I know, or political leaders in the area, about kind of their perspective. They have the view that this is a very long-term play for Putin, that he's prepared to come in and make a long-term attempt at disrupting the region and then exerting massive political pressure on some of the surrounding nations, Moldova, Belarus, Georgia, etc., in order to form some sort of competing union. And we'll see how successful he is in that. Now, again, power asymmetry. So that seems like likely to me now. Obviously, the Ukrainian people have put up a pretty aggressive fight, and that could take a pretty major toll on Russia. The Russians that I know are not in favor of this war. There has been all kinds of people from movie stars and celebrities and people, etc., going. There's been protests, etc. So we'll see how long that lasts. But my sense is that Putin is very well established, and he doesn't really care, and he's willing to undergo. One of the words of one of the political leaders I was talking to was that he said he believes that Putin is prepared to have the Russian people endure a lot of pain. And so we'll see. Anyway, so this is the first part. Now the second part, as a power asymmetry, is clearly NATO versus Russia. The power asymmetry is very much not in Russia's favor. And the problem with that is that although clearly the West, the US in particular, outclasses Russia from a military standpoint, their ability to exert that power is extremely low. And there's a few reasons for this, which again go to kind of the stupidity of Western nations over the last while. So let's start with the most obvious, which is it is the worst possible thing. Literally, sometimes we exaggerate when we say the worst thing that could possibly happen. In this case, the worst possible thing that could happen, period, would be a nuclear war. And everybody knows that. And so that has to be like a line in the sand at all costs, that you do not go there. And so this means that, Biden has offered, I think, $600 million worth of financial aid to Russia, and, they may offer weapons, etc. This is, kind of proxy war type stuff, but realistically, they can't engage militarily, which is, again, part of the kind of ridiculousness of saying we'd welcome them into NATO. If you look historically, when the Soviet Union took over Hungary, Czech Republic, and Poland, the West did nothing militarily, and they realistically can't in this situation. So what do? They decide to do sanctions. Again, the problem with these sanctions is, what are you really practically going to do here? You're in a situation where you have 50% of the gas in Germany. It comes from Russia. The energy prices have already gone up 3 times in the last year across much of Europe. Are you going to cut that gas off? Realistically, probably not. The US has, I think it's something like 7%, about 700,000 barrels a day of oil that comes from Russia. Okay, they can cut that off. But let's just kind of recognize what's going on here. So Germany has been closing nuclear power plants. Ridiculous. You're closing nuclear power plants and replacing them with buying oil and gas from Russia. I don't really understand. Somebody was terribly stupid in making those decisions, just ridiculously idiotic. In the US, there were executive orders cutting off fracking, right? And maybe you say, okay, fracking is bad. All right, great. That might be a fair environmental assessment, but then instead you're buying oil from Russia. Does that make a lot of sense? Doesn't make a ton of sense to me. So you have this situation. Then people will say, okay, well, they're laying these sanctions. Like I talked to a friend who was like, oh, they can't last more than 30 days with these sanctions. Nonsense. Complete and utter nonsense. Back in 2014, when they took Crimea, there were sanctions put against the top people in Russia as well. And so that was basically just a dress rehearsal for this. So they are very aware that there would be sanctions. They're going to be very prepared for it. They've already built their own alternative to the SWIFT network. Granted, it's not globally connected, and so totally has some limitations there. They have very low debt to GDP, so that's an advantage. They have a lot of foreign reserves. They have a lot of gold. And most importantly, their principal trading partner is China. And if you're in a situation where China does not support sanctions, then all of the rest is mostly moot. Yes, it will drive up costs. Yes, it will probably drive down income. A winner here is probably going to be China. China will probably be able to negotiate lower commodity prices from Russia because of the fact that they support them. However, that is not going to prevent Russia from having kind of like economic lifeblood. You can look at things like electronics. Well, most of the electronics are manufactured in China. So the ability to cut off a lot of the key things that would disable Russia are much more reduced. If you look at the internet infrastructure, a number of years ago, Russia created a law that they said that any internet company in Russia needed to have their servers in Russia or they were considered illegal. By the way, Google decided not to do that, and so Google is technically illegal there. So Russia runs primarily on things like Yandex. And so they don't rely on a lot of the things that you would rely on in the West. Then you can take a look at, I mentioned already, kind of foreign reserves, etc. You can just kind of see how they've insulated themselves quite a lot from what can be done from the West. Will it cause pain? Yes, it will cause pain. Will it cause issues? Yes. But realistically, from a European standpoint, I mean, the head of Italy was saying, we're going to there's no standard too high in terms of these sanctions, etc. The truth is just, you're in an environment where there's a lot of inflation. You're in an environment where the world has already started to see signs of recession, etc. Things like this. You're talking about tightening the economy. You're talking about raising interest rates, etc., etc. you just don't have a lot of room to maneuver in a way that's going to be especially painful to Russia so long as China's on board. And this is why I say it was very stupid tactically or strategically to isolate China and drive them into the arms of Russia. So I think in that sense, it's not particularly good. Probably there's a decent chance, I think, that the winner in this will be China, because of that relationship. And I'll put a link in the description below. There was an interesting kind of joint declaration that came out of the Kremlin around the time when Putin was in China, talking about the kind of joint stand that Russia and China were doing to try and kind of stand up to the West and create a world that didn't have a single power. So that's not a very good sign. Where does that go? Who knows? But I think when we, again, kind of go to these power asymmetries, when you look at Russia alone, not so significant. When you look at Russia and China together, it's pretty significant. I suspect that what you will tend to see here is you will tend to see the initial war itself be quite short, but then probably a long, protracted period that unfortunately is probably going to make Ukraine and the region in general much more dangerous, which is really, really unfortunate. So yeah, that's some things. What does this mean for the perspective of people who maybe want to go live there? Well, it's probably not going to be as good to go live there. What is it going to mean for people who are in Russia and want to go get citizenships abroad? Probably it's going to be hard. They might not be able to get citizenships, etc., at all because of the throwback. There was an interesting comment from, I can't remember who it was, but one of the politicians, because they were discussing cutting Russia off from the SWIFT network, and they pointed out that, if you do this, you're going to end up in a situation where, children in North America can no longer send money to their parents in Russia. And there's a lot of people who rely on that network. One possible outcome of this, I was reading some comments of people who fled to, I can't remember where they fled, but outside of Russia. They lost, their bank accounts, their bank cards stopped working, etc. When they fled Ukraine, And they commented the only money they have is from cryptocurrency. And so this could drive adoption of cryptocurrency. That could be a factor. It could also be something where Russia decides to embrace cryptocurrency more to try and work around sanctions. That could then have, of course, some negative blowback from the rest of the world to try and tighten up these and enforce the sanctions that they want. So we'll be interested to see what happens there. For people who are investing, just an interesting note, generally speaking, when invasions happen, marks the bottom of an investment period, and then things go up. One reason why this might be positive for people who are investing is that previously they were expecting rapid rate hikes, and the pretty much consensus view now is they won't be able to do those rate hikes. Maybe they'll get 0.25% in March, and things will be slower, and as a result, that will be more positive for the markets. Not that is any solace, but worth thinking about. So anyway, those are a few views. Let me know what it is that you guys think, and yeah, like I said, for anyone who needs help, please put it in the comments, or don't put it in the comments below. Send us a message. We will see you on the next video.